You're listening to the Journey Podcast. Can sharing a story of heartbreak become an act of healing for others? Join us today for a deeply moving story of grief and resilience. This episode contains adult subject matter, and some listeners may be triggered by this content. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Journey Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. This episode presents a deeply personal exploration of loss through one father's story. Our guest shares his journey of grief following the heartbreaking loss of his son, offering a raw and honest glimpse into a father's emotional world. We'll hear about the unique challenges of grieving as a man, the impact of societal expectations, and the powerful decision to channel grief into helping others. This conversation provides a window into the male experience of loss, challenging stereotypes and highlighting the importance of open, vulnerable expression. Jason Tuttle is a former stay-at-home parent and married father of 2 kids with multiple physical and cognitive disabilities. He lost his 15-year-old special needs son on January 28, 2022. From that day, Jason decided that he wanted to help others while he grieved. So he created Letters to Zachary as an open, raw, vulnerable way to be an example and share his feelings as well as help others to see a glimpse into the male mind and how it grieves. Here is Jason Tuttle's story. Hi, Jason. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because your story around men's grief and your personal experience is so profound that I really look forward to sharing that with our listeners. So thank you for coming on today and welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be on.
Yeah, thank you for your willingness to come on and share your story today. And with that, would you like to start us off and give us a little bit of an insight of what journey you have been on the past few years, what has happened, and where you're at now?
Sure, certainly. The past few years have been rather challenging and dynamic in my family's life, but my journey actually started almost 18 years ago. At that point in time, my wife and I had been married for about a year. I was 25 at the time. My wife was 28, and we both wanted to, because of the age that we were when we got married, we knew reasonably soon after we got married we were going to start having a family. And so it didn't take us long to get pregnant, and everything was fine as far as we knew up until about that week 20 appointment, which for those that don't know is that the appointment where you find out the sex of the child. And it was from that point that literally our world changed, because we started finding out about, medical issues. And honestly, that week 20 appointment is where we didn't officially find out it there, but that it was the start of where we found out that my son had a rare condition. And then it, for lack of better ways to say it, it kind of snowballed from there. And then we found out about all of his issues. He was born. We always knew that we wanted another child. And as you can imagine, having one child born with a rare condition and 4 or 5 other medical issues, when you tell your immediate family that you want to have another child, kind of the backlash you would get in the sense of, why would you want another child when you got one with all these medical needs? And, what's the possibility of you having another child? Which at that point in time, of all the research I had done, there was no reason to believe that we would have another child with the issues that my son had, let alone similar issues. And so we had our son, and about 2 years later, almost to the day, my daughter was born. And in the beginning, she was considered the quote unquote normal child because, as far as we knew, she didn't have any issues. And it was 6 months into my daughter being around that we found out that she had neurological delays and a couple other things. And it kind of snowballed from there. So within the first 3 years of us being married, we had two kids with multiple disabilities. My son had a rare condition, and we'd only been married 3 years. So fast forward through all of that, we, as a special needs family and special needs fathers myself, we had a lot of hurdles that we had to get over, medically speaking. And then, actually, 2.5 years ago to the day, my son suddenly and unexpectedly passed away due to issues relating to his medical special needs. And that's kind of where we are at this point.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, and what a journey you have had. And also your marriage sounds like a place of just a lot of safety and comfort and love between you, sharing that with your children, because as you said, having one child with special needs is difficult as parents as well. And then having a second child that also requires extra care and extra support adds to that. So wow. And thank you for sharing that.
Well, and the statistic of a family that has one special needs child in the family, the divorce rate is like 75%. It's ridiculously high. And I always joked about it. I go, well, if it's 75% for one special needs child, it must be 90% for my family because I have two. And then when we get to talking about my son passing away, the other statistic is the divorce rate of a family that has lost a child is like 75 or 80%. So, I joke with people and I say the percentage of divorce rate in my family should be like 90% at this point. But I'm 47, my wife is 50. And so we're considered Generation X, and we're old enough in this to where our parents are kind of old school, if you will. You get married, you only get married once. If you have problems, you work on them. To each their own. But, in my opinion, in today's world, people are so quick just to drop their marriages just because it gets difficult. And I was always taught it's not a matter of if it gets difficult, it's a matter of when it gets difficult. We're all going to have it. So my parents have been married 57 years. My wife's parents have been married, I think, 53 or 54 years. So we have that foundation to say, yeah, you're going to go through your ups and downs, but you stick with it. And then right before I decided I was going to propose, and my wife didn't know I was going to propose at that point, we got to talking about it. And I said, look, I'm only doing this once. So if this is what you want, make sure it's what you want, because I'm not doing this. It's getting hard. We're going to get a divorce down the road. We're going to work through this. And luckily, she's of the same mindset.
Yeah, thank you for giving us those insights, because it does give us a bit of a look behind the scenes of what it takes. And having children in itself is already a feat, but having children with special needs takes a bit more attention, more time, more support, so more resources as well. So yeah, thank you for giving us that insight into your relationship. And you mentioned to me before that you were working in education before. So did that change when your son was born and then later your daughter? Did you make changes in how that worked in the family dynamic?
Actually, my son was born and we found out about all of his issues. And at the time I was a new teacher in a brand new elementary school. Now, in the county that I live in, that's unheard of for a brand new teacher, especially in PE, to get a brand new school. Just because people in physical education, you can do it from the time you get out of college to like 60. It's one of those jobs that positions don't really open up a whole lot because you can do it for an extended period of time. And so after we had our son, one of the parents of the kids that I taught lived in a neighborhood literally a stone's throw from the school. And I got to talking one day of, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't really want to put my son in traditional daycare because you hear all the stereotypes of how kids always get sick. And on top of that, a normal daycare worker is not going to know what to look for a kid that's medically fragile. They're not. And, a normal daycare, at least in the States, per week is ridiculously expensive. You almost need a second job just to pay for it. And then on top of that, there are special needs daycare, but imagine what a normal daycare is and add about 40% more to that price per week. And so we were just like, I don't know if we can afford this, and I don't really want them in there. So one of the mothers, I think she heard me, or I don't know how she did, but she got in touch with me and she said, well, if you trust me with him, I don't mind watching him. And I only live in the neighborhood literally next door to the school. So it would be, you could come into work, drop him off, and then when you go out, pick him up, go home. And I agreed to that. Now, granted, she was Mormon. And so the stereotype of Mormon families is they have, a litter of children, and she had 6 kids. So I was fairly confident that she was comfortable around children. And then, like, expense wise, she charged me kind of a nominal fee, which was ridiculously cheap for what I was asking of her, but it was more to just kind of pay for her time. And so she did that for at least the first year, maybe the first two. And then after that, my parents at the time, who were much younger, watched them while I was at work for several years, just because at that point in time they were small, they were portable, if you will. They didn't necessarily have to pick them up a whole lot because of like weight, that kind of thing. So they did that, and at a certain point, the kids got into school. So at that point, I didn't necessarily have to worry. However, let's see, we got to about year 5 or 6, and my son, who was more medically fragile than my daughter because of his rare condition, he was literally in and out of the hospital. We were in the ICU at the local children's hospital probably every 6 months, the first 5 years of his life. And my last year in the school system, about the middle of the year, it got to the point to where I had burned through all of my available time, and I was essentially working for free. And it was at that point my wife and I just said, we've got to do something. And, if I'm going to work for free, I might as well stay at home. Either way, I'm not getting a paycheck. At least my attention will be focused on what's at home versus between what's at work and what's at home. So at that point, I broke a contract in the school system, which, no matter how noble it is in the school system, if you break a contract, you can forget ever working for that county again, even though they understood and they got it and all that. And honestly, I don't necessarily want to work for that county anymore, to be frank with people. So at that point, I'd been teaching almost 9 years. I left out to be a stay-at-home parent, and I was a stay-at-home parent for 12 years.
And how was that for you? I imagine, did you homeschool your son at least because of his medical condition and the fragility? Did you keep him at home, or how did that factor into you being a stay-at-home dad?
No, he still went to school. My kids have been in self-contained special education classrooms all of their lives. And so between me and the teachers, we kind of had an understanding. I'm just like, look, my cell phone's always on me. If you have an issue or if he's getting sick or something like that, I'm literally a 30-second response time. It is literally attached to my hip all day long, just because I knew that there was always a possibility of that, and I wanted it close. And so both my son and daughter were essentially in the same class. And there were multiple times throughout their lives, I'd get phone calls going, hey, your son, we feel like's running a fever, or he's just lethargic, or he's this, or he's that. Can you please come get him? Fine, I'll come get him. So that's kind of how things went through those 12 years that, I was at home, outside of kind of just what the routines were when they were at home.
Yeah. And your son sounds like a wonderful human being. And what kind of activities did he enjoy? What kind of things did he like doing? And what did you do when you spent time with him to kind of bond and spend that family time together? Anything that he particularly loved doing?
Well, to give insight into my son was born with a rare condition called Eagle Barrett syndrome, or it's more affectionately known as prune belly. And the reason why it's known as that is because he was born literally without any core abdominal muscle. He had none. And when I laid him on his back on the ground, the only thing from the outside world and his organs was the skin and the white fascia that held it together. So I could literally lay him on the floor and take my finger and from the outside touch his small intestine, his large intestine, his stomach, his kidney, his just everything. And a lot of people, understandably, it kind of freak them out. They're just like, that's not hurting them. I'm just like, no, it's not. I mean, I'm not jabbing my finger in there, that kind of thing. And so he was born without abdominal muscles, as well as he was born with one kidney that sustained some damage in utero. The Eagle-Barrett syndrome was also, he had an abnormally large bladder where I had to give him a catheter to drain his bladder every 4 hours, at least for the first 5 or 6 years of his life. And then a secondary issue, which got him in the hospital a lot, was he had normal lungs, but like he had a shallow breath. And like when you and I get a bronchitis, pneumonia style illness, we have the force to cough the crud up. And one of the reasons why is because when you have the abdominal muscles, you can kind of create that pressure in which you can push against it. And that's what helps you and I to cough the crud out, where he didn't have that. And we found out very quickly that if he got sick, and later on down the road, when I got all the respiratory machinery in my house, if I didn't catch it fast enough, ultimately I was taking him to the hospital. They were running tests on him, and he was admitted. And it was usually 7 to 10 days every time we were in the hospital. So he had that as a rare condition. On top of that, he had severe neurological delays, which means at 15 years old, when he passed away, he was functioning about 4 to 6 years old. He was epileptic. He had two different kinds of seizures. He was nonverbal. He could respond with sound if you asked him yes or no questions, but like to talk, no. And he was wheelchair bound in the sense of, could he walk on his own? No. Could I put him on the floor and could he do a modified army crawl everywhere? Yes. So he just couldn't do the stand up walking, is the reason why he was in a wheelchair. So with that being said, a lot of the things I did with him were, they were around Special Olympics. He loved Special Olympics bowling. He loved spring Special Olympics games, which were a lot of developmental things. He loved hippotherapy, which is horseback riding therapy. At the house, I live in the southern United States. And for those that do live in the southeastern part of the U.S., college football is huge. And even though I live in the state of Georgia, I lived in the state of Alabama for 17 years. Both my brothers graduated from the University of Alabama. And so I'm a diehard University of Alabama fan. And so during college football season, he'd sit there and watch football with me. And even though he didn't understand it, he had weird timing in the sense of when like a team would score a touchdown, he would immediately start clapping, even though I don't think he understood why, but he had really good timing with that. My son was really laid back. He always laughed. He never met a stranger. He was always very friendly. He loved to people watch. He was just an all around, just even with all of his obstacles, nothing really bothered him.
Wow. He sounds amazing. And I'm glad that he found so much joy in the sports and the football and the Paralympics. Sounds wonderful. And Jason, what was that journey like for you as a parent, mentally, emotionally? I mean, having your child in and out of the hospital frequently, it must take a toll on you as well. How was that journey for you?
Seeing as this talk will eventually get to grieve, at the time I didn't realize it, but after he was born, I had kind of a grieving period in a sense of it was grieving the life that we thought we were going to have versus what we were having. And I'll be honest, as someone who's very talkative, to have a nonverbal son and someone who's very sports oriented for a son that probably wouldn't get into a whole lot of sports, it was a lot to take in. And that doesn't even include understanding the 5 different issues your son has and trying to understand and educate yourself about them. And then having to deal with, at one point, we had 6 specialist doctors that we had to see every 6 months. And, we had pulmonology, urology, neurology, and then we had a pediatric neurosurgeon, and then I forget for a while there he had a specialist that dealt with kidney function, and I can't remember the name of it, but we had them until she signed off on him saying everything was okay. We even had a cardiologist at one point. So trying to manage that on top of, the first 5 or 6 years was a lot of trial and error in the sense of, yes, we knew about their main conditions, but what they don't tell you in the special needs world is there's a lot of secondary issues that happen because of the, initial, you know, sure they have epilepsy and that's the main cause, but there are secondary things that go along with it that you don't realize until it happens. And so for that first 5 or 6 years, it was a lot of trial and error. Now, after about that fifth year, I had seen enough and been around enough that not a whole lot really surprised me at that point. And at that point, I was starting to kind of get comfortable and understanding how he would function and see signs of, there were signs that right before a seizure happened that I started picking up on. And so it was at that point I started kind of seeing that going, it looks like he might have a seizure. And most often than not, he would. And I mean, at that point, we had all this medication at the house and his emergency medication at the house and that kind of thing to kind of combat all that. So it was a lot of learning. It was a lot of stress. And not so much directed at my kids, but more just, how do I do all this? How do I keep up with all this? What's my best plan or option for taking care of them? Those kind of things. Just so, we had that, but throughout the whole time and their whole lives, I got to a point where I was always in go mode, meaning I was always alert, and it didn't matter day, night, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Even my daughter now at 16, I still have a baby monitor in her room so I can hear her, because I have had times in the middle of the night, especially with my son, that I heard just a random weird sound, and I went in there and I had to literally get him up, get him dressed, and rush him to the hospital. And as you can imagine, from essentially the day we brought our son home, I developed insomnia. To this day, if I don't take medication for it, I won't sleep. So that's kind of how just life was all throughout my son's life and continues through my daughter's life.
That sounds like a lot, and a physical and mental toll that takes, being the carer in that case. And thank you for sharing that, and again giving us that look behind the scenes of what was happening. And of course, we come to the time where your son unexpectedly passed away, and this was, you said, about 2.5 years ago to the day. So take us through what happened in as much detail as you'd like, or you'd like to share, and let us know what that journey was like for you.
So even though my son was medically fragile and the more medically fragile of my two kids, at that point, because years earlier we had kind of a major like midsection reconstruction surgery, and he had just gone through spinal fusion surgery. After that midsection surgery, we went from every 6 months in the hospital to rarely being in the hospital. And a lot of it was due to the surgery, and a lot of it was just due to the fact that I'd become so proactive to things once I started learning about them that it kept him out of the hospital, honestly. And so about 3 days before he passed, he had gone to school. Both my kids came home, and I did my normal routines, and I got them both in the house. I got them out of their wheelchairs. He was in diapers all of his life. My daughter still is. I'd get them both home. I'd kind of get them undressed, get their change their diapers, get them in kind of their lounge wear, that kind of thing, give them time just to relax because they'd been in school all day. And then we'd have some, lounging time, and, I'd cook dinner, that kind of thing. And so I made him his favorite meal that we had, and he ate like a horse. And so after that, what the nighttime routine usually was I'd put them in the living room and either on the couch or on the floor and give them their toys. They'd play with their toys, kind of thing. And about 7:30 at night, I'd put my daughter to bed, and then I'd keep my son up about another hour just to give him some one-on-one time. I love my daughter, but my daughter can be intense. And I've had many a time where my son, even though he couldn't talk, he'd look at me and give me this look of like, I need a break. And so outside of the fact that my daughter's very routine oriented, and if I don't put her to bed at 7:30, even to this day, she will give me a hard time. She knows that's her bedtime. She wants nothing different. Even though we've told her many times, girl, you're 15 years old. You're supposed to stay up a little later, but she wants nothing to do with it. So fine, I'll do that. So we keep him up for another hour. And typically what we do is we'd bring him into my wife and I's bedroom and we both lay on both sides of our king size bed and he'd be in the middle and we'd watch TV and goof off with him for about another hour. So that night we are getting close to his bedtime. We use an electric toothbrush with him because he likes the vibration of it. And my wife was brushing his teeth and she went a little too far and he like threw up a little bit. And I looked at her and I went, well, maybe you hit his gag reflex and just something was in the system and it came up. I didn't think much about it. Cleaned up the little bit of mess he had and put him to bed. My kids from the day we brought them home have been great sleepers. Never had an issue with it. And, God gave us all the other issues. He had to at least give us something. And so he gave us good sleepers. And so that night he was up and down all night, which is unusual for him. And the next morning, my wife and I had gotten up and I was a stay-at-home parent at the time. And I said, I'm going to text the teacher and keep him home. I said, I don't, because at this point we think he's got a 24-hour virus, which he'd had many times in his life. Didn't think anything about it. I said, I'm going to text his teacher, let him know we're not going to bring him in because he's in a self-contained classroom. And if he were contagious, I wouldn't want to spread it to other medically fragile children. And so I texted her and said, hey, I'm keeping Zach home. I'm not sure what he's got, not sure he's contagious. I said, but I want to be on the safe side. And she's just like, okay, see you tomorrow. So we keep him home. And that whole day, I look at him and go, buddy, you can take a nap. You're not missing anything. All I'm going to be doing is sitting on the couch on my laptop, getting some work done. That's all I'm doing. You're not missing anything. And he absolutely refused to go to sleep, which in hindsight, that should have struck me, but in the moment it didn't. I was just like, he's got to just be overtired like kids get that and start fighting, having to go to sleep. Kind of I'm not tired, and then they immediately fall asleep. So throughout the day he does that, and he doesn't want to eat a whole lot. He doesn't want to drink a whole lot. And at least for one day, that doesn't really catch my attention just because I'm thinking, well, he's probably just overtired. And when I'm overtired, I don't really want to drink or eat a whole lot. So I didn't think much about it. So that night, I put my daughter to bed and I look at my wife and I go, I'm gonna go ahead and put Zachary to bed. He's got to be exhausted. And so I put him to bed and he immediately gets quiet. We don't think anything about it. We just think he's exhausted. He immediately fell asleep. Fine. Didn't hear him all night. And that next morning we get up. I said, at this point, see, that was Thursday night. This is Friday morning. I go, you know what? I'm going to text his teacher and keep him home one more day. I said, if he's not feeling well, at least at that point, we've now got the weekend to get through for him to recover. And then we can just send, I'd hate to send him to school, them say he's not doing well, and then me have to go get him. Now, in hindsight, I'm glad I didn't because with what was going on, he would have probably passed at school and I would have never forgiven myself. So we get my daughter up, we send her off to school, and we go into his room about 8:30 in the morning, which is kind of the typical weekend time that we get him up. And usually when I go in there, he's really excited, bouncing on his bed, all that. And I walk in there and he's awake looking at me, but he's not really bouncing. And that kind of catches my attention, but I think, well, maybe he's still not feeling well. And, I don't want to be bouncing in my bed if I'm not feeling well either. So I walk over to his right side and I notice that he's got a dark green streak of fluid coming out of the side of his mouth. And in all of my medical knowledge, I go, the only thing that's dark green is bile. And why is bile coming out of his mouth? This is not good at all. So I go to pick him up and he's really floppy, like he can't hold himself up. And even that doesn't strike me because I've had times where he's had really bad respiratory viruses and that happened. And so when I did that, I thought, something's really not right. And I get him out into the living room, put him on the floor, and I go through my medical protocol in my head. take my stethoscope out and I listen to his chest to make sure it's not a respiratory virus. I cath his bladder just to make sure it's not related to his bladder. Don't get a whole lot out. Now, the one thing that does catch my attention is kids that have prune belly without the muscles, their stomachs are kind of pliable like a sponge. When I went to feel his stomach that day, it was like a brick. It was rock hard. And that caught my attention. And I went, something's really not right. And in the moment, even though things were going in real time in my head, it was slowing down just to give me that little bit of time to kind of figure out what I'm going to do. And honestly, it was just a hunch, which a lot of the times I've had a hunch. I've taken him up there. He was admitted, several hours after I took him up there. So it was a hunch. And I looked at my wife because she was working at home at the time. I go, I'm going to take him up to the local children's hospital. I said, something is not right. And I don't know what it is. And I said, I don't think it's getting any better. And she goes, okay. And so I get him dressed. I get him into his wheelchair. I get him in the van and I drive off. At this point, my wife is thinking, well, I'm going to take him up there. He's going to get admitted. We'll be there, 7 to 10 days for whatever it is. We'll come home, which is kind of the standard for what always happened. I'm doing like 90 miles an hour up the interstate because where I am in the city of Atlanta, I'm about 60 miles from the local children's hospital, which sounds like a long distance. But for those of us that live in Atlanta, that's nothing. And I've driven up there so many times I can do it blindfolded. And so I'm doing 90 miles an hour through Atlanta trying to get up there. I finally get up to the hospital and I park in the parking deck. I get him out and he's really floppy and it catches my attention. And I go, something's really not right. I get up into the hospital, get into the ER, and a lot of ERs, you got a line that you've got to snake your way through. I skip that line like to head up to the nurse because something is really not right. And before I get there, the security guard walks over to me as if to say, you need to get in line. And before he opens his mouth, I go, I don't think he's breathing. I need help right now. And so he looks at the nurse and almost like snaps his finger at her and she sees him and she tells me to come with her. I've been in this hospital 100 times, and this is the first time I have taken my son in a wheelchair and in a full run back into the ER, take him to a trauma room. So we go into the trauma room. I instinctively get him out of his chair. I put him on the table and I back out of the way in hopes that they'll let me stay in there. One, because he's a child. Two, because he's nonverbal and he doesn't talk. And the state in which he's in, he's not going to respond to him. So luckily they let me stay in there. In fact, there was another trauma room where the doors were butted up to and they were open and I just backed out into there. So, because like when we came in there, literally 30 people came into that room out of nowhere and started working on them. So I back out into the side room. The head ER doc comes over to me and goes, tell me up to the minute how long your son has been this way. And I said, I think he's been X number of minutes, plus or minus about 3 minutes. And she goes, okay. She goes off, barks orders. She comes back and she goes, explain to me the scenario as to why you brought him in here. And I told her everything. She goes, okay. And she starts barking orders at him again. Well, from the moment that we get in there, they cut off his clothing, they intubate him, which is putting the tube down his throat to get into his lung to give him air, and they start chest compressions. Now, at this moment, most people would probably start being emotional and all that. But to me, I'm watching it going, watching the monitors and all that. And I'm kind of compartmentalizing what's going on. And I just think they're trying to save his life. And they do chest compressions for probably 15 continuous minutes. And then they decide that they're going to get the paddles out to try to shock him back to life. And even though I see that and I know what it means, it doesn't register in my brain what's going on. And so they go and shock him. And just like a medical drama, he literally lifts off the table. And so when that happens, because of all of his respiratory issues, I immediately look at the monitor to watch his respiratory rate and his heart rate and his breathing rate and all that kind of thing to see what it does. I look at it and it goes boop and goes right back to what it's doing. And at that moment in my brain, I go, he's not coming back. Now, I don't get emotional at this point, but it starts to register what the reality is right before me. And so they continue working on him, and they literally shock him like 4 more times. And so finally, towards the end, the head ER doc comes over to me and goes, well, we can shock him again. She said, but I think the outcome's going to be the same. And I said, this is out of my medical wheelhouse. do whatever you feel like is professionally necessary. And so they shock him again, nothing happens, and they pronounce him. So I understandably kind of turn around into the other room and have a moment for just a second, and I immediately clear up and I call his mother. Now understand, his mother at this point thinks that he's going to be admitted, that he's just going to be up there, they're going to treat him, he's going to come home in about a week. I have to tell his mother that he's dead on the table. And then I'll never forget the sound she made when I told her. And then I hung up with her, and then I called my parents who watched him for years. I'll never forget the sound my mother made. So I hang up with them. I turn around, and like the head of the care team for the hospital comes in, we're sorry for your loss, that kind of thing. And before she can say anything else, I look at her and I point at my son. I go, this is going to sound cold, harsh, whatever you want to call it. I said, but I'll deal with this in a minute. I said, I need to know some answers before I do anything. And she goes, okay, what do you need to know? And I rapid fire like 10 questions at her. What happens from here? Are you going to do an autopsy? If you are going to do an autopsy, what's the turnaround time? If you're not going to do an autopsy, why are you not going to do an autopsy? Who do I need to contact when I finally do get to a funeral home? Where is he going to go after we leave here today? What's the contact info? And I just rapid fire all this off. And she literally takes a step back and she goes, okay, well, the first thing we're going to do is X, Y, and Z. And then I'll come back in here. I'll let you know. And then we'll go to the next steps. I said, okay. At this point, my wife, I told, when I talked to my wife, I said, call your parents who live close to us. I said, have them come pick you up, let them drive you up. You are not in a state to drive. And so the hospital goes, you can be in this room for as long as you want. Now, you can't be in here all day, but, we won't necessarily need this room. And so I'm sitting by myself with my son who just passed away in this room by myself. And, I tell people say, well, is there anything that stands out to you outside of the event that happened? I said, well, one of the things that I noticed was as I was sitting there with him was how quickly the heat left his body once he actually passed away. He got cold. Not just him, but probably the human body. It gets cold quick the moment that life ceases to exist. So there was that. And then my wife came up and her parents came up and, we had our time with them. And one of the hardest things I ever had to do was I had to take all of his cut off clothing, put it on his empty wheelchair and walk it through that hospital to put in our van and understand that my wife came home with me. So we drove 60 miles in that van, dead silent the entire way home. And if you notice behind me, I've got Zach written on the wall. I know people can't see it, but behind me on the wall, it's got my son's name, Zach. And right by where it says Zach is his wheelchair. That wheelchair has not moved in 2.5 years. What you're seeing sitting on top of it, well, one is a blanket, but under it is still all of his cut off clothing. I have not moved it. Now, I've donated a lot of his stuff to people in need because I felt like that would help with his legacy, that kind of thing to help others in the special needs community. I'm still 2.5 years out and I cannot donate his wheelchair. At some point I might, but for right now, I can't do it. And so we get home that day. Well, first of all, we come home, we stop by my parents' house. My whole family is there. I walk in the door and the first person I see is my eldest brother and I just buckle. Like I lose it. I can't control myself. I'm just bawling, crying kind of thing. And I kind of go into my parents' room. I regain composure and I sit out there with everybody and, they're wanting to know what's going on. And so I'm trying to tell them and, about every fourth word, I start getting kind of that shaky voice where, you're going to lose it kind of thing. And it takes me forever to get through it. And, I tell them and, from that point forward, the next day we do the funeral home and we get all that going. And it just, for the next 2 weeks, we're doing funeral home stuff, and then we do viewings and services and all that stuff. So from the time that we believe that we noticed it to the time he was actually pronounced was less than 36 hours. It sounds like a long time, but in reality, 36 hours is not a long amount of time.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to give you a break here for just a few moments so you can take a breath. And Thank you for that account and for sharing your son's story with us as well.
Sure.
And I would imagine that after what you shared with us, that there was a bit of a different experience that you and your wife had because you were present when your son passed away and she was not. So how did you reconcile that in the weeks after his passing or in the months after the passing? Did that bring you closer together? Or were there things that you had to reconcile around that event?
Well, between my wife and I, the relationship that each of us had with our son and even our daughter was different. It's not good or bad. It's just, it was different. I had a different bond with our son because I did all of the physical medical care. I did all of the doctor's visits. I did all of the school IEP stuff. I did, when he was in the hospital, I was with him in the hospital from the moment I brought him there to when he was admitted, the entire time he was there till he was discharged and we came home. And so we had kind of unspoken bond, if you will. Whether he was nonverbal or not, we still kind of had an unspoken bond. I mean, I got to the point where I could read his body language so well that I knew what was going on before he ever really showed signs of anything going on. And there were several instances where when I got to the hospital, the doctor was dumbfounded at how I got my son there literally as the moment as a pneumonia was forming. Like he even told me, he said, "I don't know how you did it." And I said, there was just something about it that I recognized, and I was just like, we got to go. And so, but it was different. And like the day of the event, I've told my wife this many times, and I will go to my grave believing it. I've told her, I said, of the two of us that had to be, if either one of us had to experience that moment that I did, I'm glad it was me. I said, even though it may cause me issues the rest of my life, even though it may give me PTSD, which I've later accepted that it has, I'm glad it was me versus you having to witness that moment. I said, just because, as a father and as a male and as the traditional kind of protector and provider and all that, I'm glad it was me versus you. It makes losing him no less sad, but I'd rather be the bearer of that additional stress versus you. And I mean, she understands it. I mean, I believe she agrees with it, but I just said it was a traumatic experience, and that's just something you don't need. I'd rather you remember him in the good moments that you always remembered him in versus me having to remember to. Now, what I explained was kind of 70% of the detail of what I explained. I remember in much greater detail than that, just because I'm a very visual person and I remember specific details. And so we, through that period, we leaned into each other, but we also, when we found it necessary, gave each other space because we knew that we were both going to have our sad moments, our sorrowful moments, our regretful moments, our angry moments, all that. And me being someone who can read body language, which on a side note, she hates the fact I can read body language just because, I can tell when she's upset before she can. And some days it drives her nutty. Although I've gotten much better over the years about that, about not pointing it out. So when I would notice that I felt like she was having a moment and all that, I would kind of tend to myself just to give her that moment versus going, "Hey, what's going on?" That kind of thing. And she would do the same for me. We have never been traditional. Typically, when she deals with things, she's kind of quiet and unto herself, and that's fine. That's her way of dealing with things. At least at home, with my son, I'm very outwardly emotional. There are multiple days, especially in the beginning, where I would lose it just bawling, kind of, a Mack truck just hit me out of nowhere. And, all the memories are coming back and what I saw and what I dealt with and that kind of thing. So it was really kind of a give and take scenario for at least probably the first year. Usually for men, the first response is anger. And it was for me. And it wasn't directed at anyone per se. It was more of an internal anger. And my wife would probably, I've heard her say that probably she was angry for that first year. And from what I saw, now I haven't really talk to her about it per se, because, there's just some things we just understand. You don't need to talk about, it's there. But from what I saw, it was pretty much an internal thing as well. So we both had our moments with it, is kind of how we dealt with it, at least in that first probably 12 months.
And what has your journey looked like since that? So if we go forward from that, that's another year and a half since that first year passed.
Mm-hmm.
What has your journey looked like since then? How have you been coping? What kind of things have you found that have helped when these moments come where you're just absolutely lost in that grief? And how are you moving forward in life while still having the memory of your son, but trying to put together the pieces so that you can be there for your daughter and also continue living and being there for her? So what has that journey looked like for you?
Well, I'm a proponent of counseling and therapy. I've always done it. I believe that you do it until the season in which you're in it passes by, and then typically you stop. And then if another season comes up, you go back to see the counselor. And so, literally, probably 2 or 3 weeks before my son had passed, I'd literally told my counselor, I said, I think I'm through this season. I said, I don't think I've got a whole lot to talk about. And I said, I don't want to waste an hour of your time when I feel like I don't have an hour's worth of stuff to talk about. And so I think I said, you've helped me get through this. And I said, if I should need you again, I said, I know you've got a waiting list, so I'll contact you and see what your wait list is like and try to get back in. Okay, great, wonderful. And then my son passed, and I immediately messaged her and said, hey, this is going to be out of the blue. I said, but I really need kind of an emergency session. And I said, you'll understand when we talk. Is there anything in the near future that, you've got available? And luckily she did. And at that point, I started seeing her, and it was actually her suggestion to start journaling. Honestly, I resisted it in the beginning just because I didn't think I was in the headspace for it. I didn't think it was for me, that kind of thing. But her fateful comment, if you will, was, well, you don't have to do it right now, but put it on the back burner. At some point, you can pick it up. It's a mindfulness activity, meaning it distracts you from what's actually going on and gives you an outlet, at least to get it out. And even if you never share it with anybody, she goes, at least you can get it off your chest. And she said, even if you wanted to go the next step of printing it out and then burning it, that would help you. And so that idea kind of sat on my side table for 9 months afterwards. I didn't touch it. I didn't look at it. It had nothing to do with it. And then one day I was on Facebook or social media, and I think I was watching a reel, and something I was watching hit me. It wasn't about grief or death, but it was something in there that reminded me of my son or something we had gone through. And I just start bawling. I mean, I'm just losing it sitting in my chair. And at that point, I get on a Word document, and in traditional letter form, date, dear Zachary, that kind of thing, I just start typing, and I write like a 2-page letter. Now, as kind of a side note to it, I write in the moment. I write when I'm open, raw, unfiltered. So, like, if in the moment when I was writing, I felt like I needed to drop an F bomb or something like that in what I was writing, that's how I wrote. Because I felt, to this day, I feel like people need to understand the good, the bad, and the ugly of grief. Because TV and society does kind of a rose-colored version of grief. This happens, you grieve for a short period of time, and everything's wonderful after it. No, that's not how it works at all. And I wanted the people to get, whether they liked it or it offended them, I wanted them to see the reality of what grief actually is. And so, I did that for a while, and then I'm a researcher, so I got on Facebook and I started researching grief and, grief groups and that kind of thing. And as we all know, Facebook has a group for everything. And I actually found a small group that was parents that had lost a special needs child, which I was shocked to find because that's a very specific subgroup of grief. I wasn't looking for it, but I just happened to find it. So I get in this group, and understandably, it's 98% women and probably 2% men that are in there because, men, we're so wonderful about sharing our feelings. I get in there and I introduce myself, and I actually get to know the admin very well. And so I'm in there a couple of weeks, and I finally say, I said, "Do you mind if I post one of my journal entries?" She said, "No, we would love for you to." She said, "We rarely get that, and we'd like to know kind of from your point of view as a man what you're going through." And I said, "Okay." And so right before I posted it, in my head, I go, now I have to prepare myself. I might get a very good response, but I might also get a very negative response. Even though it's a noble thing I'm doing, I might have people react to this in a negative way. And am I in the headspace that I need to be on to be able to accept negative comments? And so I thought about it and thought about it and thought about it. And in my typical fashion, I literally went, screw it. I'm gonna post it. So I post it in the group, and I almost immediately get this massive positive response. And it kind of surprises me. And I've always had a hard time kind of promoting myself, which is ironic that I'm on a podcast saying I have a hard time promoting myself. But I always have, I've always, people go, "Well, you're such an inspiration." And I always go, "No, my son and daughter are inspirations because of what they have to deal with. I'm just the caretaker of it." And I've always been that way. And so I had women come in there going, "I have never told anybody what's deep down inside me of how I feel and how rough it's been. I don't know you, and you have said word for word to the letter exactly how I feel." She was just like, "It's like you were reading my mind." And I went, "Well, I appreciate that you like it. It was inspired by my son." And I said, "I'm glad that it resonates with you." And I said, "If this letter can help you, then my job is done. Even if it's just you, my job is done." And so for weeks there, about once a week, I'd post one, and every time I was getting this kind of response. And so after several weeks, I sit back and go, well, I think I've got something here. Let's see if I can build on it. And so I keep posting them. And throughout this time, I get, "Well, have you ever thought about doing a podcast?" And at the time, I was like, "I don't think I'm in the headspace for it," because at that moment, I was less than a year of grieving. And I was just like, "I don't have the brain space for it. I've got too much in my head as it is." And they said, "Okay, well, have you ever thought about writing a book?" And I said, "Well, at that moment, I didn't think I had enough material to start a book, let alone finish a book. Now I've got a binder by my feet that's 2.5 inches wide that I could probably start and finish a book. At some point, I may do that, but right now, I don't believe I am." And so I said, "I don't think I have enough material." And then they went through several kind of examples of things I could do. And so finally, the last person goes, "Well, have you ever thought about doing a Facebook page and just making it like you're as a blogger creator on there? And then you could at least like copy and paste, and then you wouldn't be necessarily creating more material. You'd just be copy and pasting." And I went, "Well, I could do that." So I did that. And like most people, when you start a page, I had 10 or 20 followers on there, family, friends, coworkers that knew of the situation. And so it was like probably 98% of the groups of pages out of there is the kind of following I had at that moment. And so I kept doing it. And I finally just got this idea in my head. I thought, I'm going to reach out to some of what I consider the big names in the grief community. And I'm going to see if they'll let me pick their brain. So I reached out to several big names. I said, "Hey, my name is so and so. I've got this page." I said, "This is what the page is about." And I said, "I've gotten a lot of positive comments about it. And I feel like I have something here and I want to try to get it to grow. Can you at least tell me things you did that worked well and things that you did that you thought maybe that wasn't the right way to go?" And literally all of them were phenomenal. They were like, "Sure, we'd love to." And they would go, "Well, if you're going to write a book, you're going to want a professional website. If you decide that you don't want to write a book, you're going to want to do you're going to want to do A, B, and C. However, if you do these things, don't do D, E, and F, or these things did not work for me. They might work for you, but they didn't work for me." And so I took all of that into consideration. And once I started doing that and doing like, there was even tips on, what I should put as my Facebook header and what I should put as the logo on there and how it would draw people in based on what branding, if you will. And so I started doing all that and I started getting followers. Like it was getting to be like there were days I was getting 30 and 40 a day is what was happening. And it was just blowing my mind at this point. I'm just like, I never thought that I would get this kind of following. And it just kept growing and growing and growing. And initially, the group was for just men. And the reason why it was initially for them was because I was getting so upset that it didn't matter what grief group I was going into. There were very few men in there. Most of them did not want to talk, at least not on a somewhat regular basis. And even though they weren't going to experience exactly what I did, I wanted at least someone that was kind of in the ballpark that could kind of get what I was going through. And I just couldn't find anybody. So Letters to Zachary started for just men. And then after a while of it being that way, I went, well, I want to create a bigger audience. So I need to open it up a little more. It's still essentially for men. But then the next evolution it's for men, but I'm now opening it up to anybody that's lost a loved one, whether it's a mother, a father, a spouse, a sibling, a child, you name it. And it grew some more. And then I thought, I still need to open it up a little more. And so now it's in its kind of, it's still all of those things, but in its third evolution, I open it up. Even though women could be a part of it before, I specifically opened it up to women. And the reason why I did that and made a point to do that was for a while there, I was getting women that would say, well, we lost our son or daughter or such and such in our family 6 months, a year ago, and my husband is not opening up. What can I do to get him to open up? And so I would kind of give them tips and things I felt like would work. And so soon thereafter, I created a document called the Male Grief Constitution. And I listed 10 points out of things that I felt like if a woman was going to come up to me, these 10 things would at least help to get me in a space to want to open up. Now, would I? Sometimes it would depend on the day, but it would at least open the door to say, hey, this is a safe environment for you to be able to open up. And so I created that. And all the women that would contact me, I would go, now, here's something to help your husband, your boyfriend, whoever. I said, is it going to magically make them open up? I said, it may or may not, but it will create a situation to make it possible. I said, because all men are different. I said, whereas I may open up a little more, if your husband is a crusty old Marine veteran that was in Vietnam War or one of these wars, I said, it may take a lot of work. I said, just think of the type of person you have, someone who wants to be a Marine, that kind of thing, that factors into it. And so it will at least help. So it has evolved a couple of times since the beginning from men to everybody to women and the other reason for specifically women was even though men might not come to me, those women that were close to them that may have come to my page might be able to use this in a roundabout way to get to them is what the reasoning was behind it. And I mean, the standard percentage of followers on any grief page is about 4% of men. My page as of yesterday was 12.2% men. So I'm 3 times the average. Now, do they comment all the time? Not so much, but they're still a part of it. They still see the post. And a lot of men, even though they may not comment, they still see it, they still read it, and they'll do whatever they're going to do with that information. So in a roundabout way, I'm still helping them, even though I may not always see their name pop up, is kind of how this has gone. And I'm in my 9th month since I've started doing this page. I'm inching upwards to 1,100 followers. I have follower representation in 45 of the 50 US states, and I have representation in 26 different countries is what it has come to up to the other day. If you'd have told me 9 months ago that I would have this kind of following and talking to you being, me being in the States and you being outside of, Western France, I'd have said, you have lost your mind. There's no way. So that's kind of where I'm at this point.
Wow. And what a lovely way to share your son Zach's memory and keep it alive, and at the same time support men and women, families, children, grandparents on their own journeys of grief that they are experiencing. That sounds like a wonderful project. And you also let me know that you have a coloring book coming out. And so, of course, by the time that our listeners are listening to this episode, your coloring book will be available already. So share a little bit with us what that's all about.
So, about a month ago in the podcasting group that you and I connected in, I came across a post of a lady that was a part of a publishing company based out of, I think it's Virginia in the States. And she was putting a post on there to get people on her podcast. And, she made some comment that, if you have a podcast and you're like my first 5 people, I'll put something out on like one of the news wires here in the States that for those in the States, it may be the same thing in France. Like the Associated Press is one of them that she's a part of, which would be huge to a podcast because that literally goes out to everybody worldwide. And so I messaged her and said, hey, I said, I don't have a podcast. I said, here's my story. I'd love to be on your podcast. I said, if anything, I said, I could certainly use the promotion on being a story put out. And so she contacts me and says, I don't know if the podcast would necessarily work, but she said, I've got some ideas that may work for you. Can we talk? And I said, sure. And so probably a week later, she comes down there and she said, well, I've got an idea. She said, I've done it before for someone else kind of in your position. She said, we've done coloring books before. Would you be interested? And I said, yeah, that's unique. And, as a Generation X, as in age, adult coloring books have become popular in recent years. And I thought, well, that's a good idea. At least for people my age, that would be something that would get their attention. And so we molded over and talked about what we were going to do. So basically the premise is you can't get to it now because we're in production at this point. But when it initially started, you could go to my website, you could scroll down to a button that said community projects. It would take you to a link for a survey. And so the way I presented it to people was if you have lost a loved one, especially a child, but it can be anybody you've lost, go to my page, hit this link, you'll get a survey. It's going to ask you things like first name, last initial, stuff about your loved one, attributes like things that they liked, maybe a quote, maybe a sentence or two, that kind of thing about them. All these different attributes about your loved one. And then once you hit submit, what it'll do is it'll send it to the artist. They'll take all of your information that you put in there. They'll try to focus on the main point that you're doing. And they'll essentially create a one-page coloring page, just kind of a collage of stuff that all goes together on this page, almost like someone walking into a tattoo shop saying, I want all these elements and to look like it's cohesive. And so that's what they do. Now, the other thing was anybody that did the survey, it didn't cost them a dime. They didn't have to put any money up for it. So that was a big incentive too. You don't have to pay for it. All you have to do is put it in there. And I said, once you do it and it comes out, I said, not only will it be I'm very tactile and very visual. And so I said, it will be a tactile, living, active, and interactive memorial for you and literally anybody that buys it. So if you're looking for something to create a legacy, at least a little bit for your loved one, that once this gets out on Amazon, it'll be there forever because she'll want to sell it forever to make money on it. And so I had a lot of turnout for that. And then the next stage of it I went to was I dealt with a lot of people like yourself that had podcasts and podcasts, memorials, foundations, websites, you name it. And so what I told them is I said, not only will you be able to do that, I said, but there's also a page on that survey that you can put all of your, like if you've got a podcast, you can put the name of your podcast, you can put the website information, to advertise for yourself. I said, so when your page is done, you're going to be able to flip to the back of the coloring book and it's going to have all of your stuff listed in there to advertise. And I said, one, it's not going to cost you anything to do it. And I said, honestly, the only real cost you're going to have is, let's say the book's $25. It's going to cost you $25 to buy the book. I said, where on this planet can you advertise your business for $25? Well, nowhere. I said, so it's a win-win. And then the last reason why I did it was I have a daughter. And so even though she's got developmental delays and all that, but any normal child my daughter's age, grief is a difficult topic. And so I decided to make the coloring book so the parent can give this to the child. It can give them a de-stressing activity while they color. And as they're doing it as a bonding moment, let's say they buy two of them, mama's doing the same page as she's doing or he's doing. While they're doing that, it's a de-stressing activity. And then it can give the parents some time to think about how they can kind of dumb down, if you will, the difficult topics of grief to be able to talk to their child while they're doing this de-stressing mindfulness activity to be able to get these points across to them over time is the three big reasons why I did it. And so for those that are interested, the book will be released August 16th, 2024. At this point, I don't expect any delays by any stretch of the imagination. You will be able to go onto my website, which it will be listed in the show notes. It's just like the page on Facebook, Letters to Zachary. This is not so much pertinent to y'all, but currently it's a website through the publisher. But by the time the book comes out and you guys are on this podcast, it will be my professional site because I'm unveiling my professional site the day before. So it'll still be the same website address as the host has. It'll just be a more professional looking website versus, me not knowing what I'm doing kind of thing. So that's what my next project is, outside of just trying to get on stages to do public speaking.
Sounds wonderful. And I can't wait to share this coloring book and also your page and the Letters to Zachary with our audience. And of course, we'll be linking to all of Jason's offerings in the show notes as well. So as you mentioned, be sure to check there on the current website address, the link to his page if you'd like to check that out on Facebook. If you'd like to join in or you have lost a loved one and you would like to connect, make sure you check the links and use those as resources for yourself and also to share your experience. I believe, as Jason said, sharing is part of how we process our grief. It does help us heal. So if you have a story to share, you would like to share it with someone, be sure to reach out and comment maybe also on Jason's page and join that support that's out there worldwide by the sounds of it, as Jason said, in many, many countries. So there's a lot of support and we don't have to do this alone, whether we are male or female, young or old, we don't have to do this alone. So thank you for sharing that, Jason. And this has been such a special episode, and in the way that you shared your story and your son's story was so touching and so profound. So I just want to thank you for bringing that vulnerability to us. You touched on the fact that it is more difficult for men to open up about this and to share their feelings, their grief, what they're going through. So I just want to thank you for doing that today and leading the way. I'm hoping that men who listen to this will sit back and maybe say, I can share. Maybe it will help me. Maybe that will help me make sense of some things or process some of my own feelings and grief. So thank you for being here today. And thank you for sharing this very profound story of yourself, your family, your son. Thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you so much for having me on. The last thing I would leave people with is, don't let people that have not experienced what you're experiencing tell you how to experience it. There's a lot of unwritten rules in society, especially as it relates to men. One of the attributes that may be a detriment to men that could be a very positive to men in this world is if you feel the need to express yourself, be stubborn about it. I mean, honestly, be stubborn about it. Only those of us that have actually been through this get it. And even between those of us that have been through it, it's still very individualized. So you have aspects of it that I may not understand and vice versa. So, keep expressing yourself because that is the healthy way to deal with it.
Absolutely. And thank you for those words of wisdom. And I do hope that this project reaches as many people as it can all across the globe. And you continue shining your light and sharing your son's legacy with everyone as well. So thank you for today, Jason. Take really great care of yourself, and I wish you all the best going forward and in your journey as you heal and create more projects. And I'm very curious to see what else comes out of this. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Journey podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Journey on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejourney.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.